Welcome to the Informed Simplicity Project, where we're taking a shared journey to learn more about our bodies from a polyvagal perspective. I'm Dr. Jordan Harris, your host. Today we have our amazing guide, Dr. Julia Conroy, and this is our series on how stress impacts our bodies. How you doing, Julia?
Good. I'm excited. I love talking about this.
It's a lot of fun. It's been fun.
It's been fun for me. Yeah.
So I want to do a brief recap for
Mhm.
people coming in new to this. And basically, we're looking at how stress impacts our bodies, our physical health, and our mental health from a
Mhm.
polyvagal perspective. And in an oversimplified sort of way, the polyvagal perspective sort of says that when we feel safe, and it's also sort of when we face, small sort of challenges, right? That we are in a state that they call a social engagement state, right?
Mhm.
Where we can use people to help us manage big emotions, help our bodies to regulate and find balance.
Mhm.
Um, and also, this is where our bodies are really, really good at growing and
Mhm.
repairing, right?
Mhm.
But then when we face a threat, something that's more than a challenge, that's an actual threat, we
Mhm.
go into fight or flight,
Mhm.
right? And flight behaviors are things where we feel anxious, we feel scared, we run away from something, or maybe we
Mhm.
go into fight, right? We're chronically irritable, we're angry,
Mhm.
we might go into something to attack it.
Mhm.
And if that strategy fails, or if that strategy doesn't seem adequate to the threat, usually when we feel like, man, we are under attack for our lives, we go into a freeze state, a shutdown
Mhm.
state. Maybe we
Mhm.
faint, we dissociate, we get numb.
Mhm.
And this, right, this sort of thing that the first response is a social engagement response. And the second response, if that doesn't work, is a fight or flight response. And then a third response, if the other two don't work, is a shutting down response. This is
Mhm.
like the basis of polyvagal theory and
Mhm.
what we mean when we say that we respond in a hierarchy. Right? This is like the
Mhm.
polyvagal ladder that we talk about a lot.
Mhm. Mhm.
So today we're taking that framework and looking at the stress research on how stress impacts our metabolism.
Mhm.
And to do that, we're using Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Mhm.
Uh,
Good summary, Jordan.
Thank
That was
you.
great.
I practiced. I was trying to pantomime Vanna White the whole time, Um, have you ever like met him or been in a conference with him or Sapolsky?
I haven't. I've just read his work, and haven't interacted with him face to face. Have you?
I've been to a conference he was at, and
Okay.
I'm I'm also, like just the nerd of all nerds. So he has his like capstone class up on YouTube.
Mhm. Oh, really?
Yeah, he teaches I think for Stanford, and yeah, he has like his whole like one of his a 15-week lecture. And I think I've listened to all of them. Maybe it's like him, and I've seen him at a conference. This guy
Mhm.
is hilarious. If you ever have the chance to see him at a conference, it's like stand-up comedy from a scientist. Like he's hilarious. He's just a riot.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see that in the writing in the book, that
Oh
there's
man.
like the comparisons and the analogies that he makes, but also
Yes.
like there's just some like quick wit slid in there, and it's
Yes.
not surprising.
Yeah. I don't think we're doing the book justice because this guy is he's really funny. He's really funny. So if you or anybody else gets the chance to see him or wants to check him out on YouTube, he is just phenomenal.
And
It's
what
the
can be
most entertaining science
funnier?
class you've ever been
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, and I mean, what can be funnier than, the body's response to stress? It's like all that content is just
It's just
waiting,
waiting
right?
there,
It's
right?
a such low-hanging fruit, but somebody's gotta pick it. So I'm glad
Somebody's got to
Sapolsky
pick it.
is. Yeah.
That's the brilliance of it. You're like,
Yeah.
how is this going to be hilarious? But he just makes it so good.
Awesome.
Um, and so in this chapter on the metabolism,
Mhm.
on our metabolic system,
Mhm.
he is really honing in on three different areas, right? He talks about basically how our metabolism works.
Mhm.
Then he goes into type 1 diabetes or juvenile diabetes. He then goes into type 2 diabetes or adult onset diabetes. And then he talks about metabolic syndrome or syndrome X. And for me, starting off, like that alone was fascinating because one, I didn't know anything about our metabolism. And two, I really did not understand the terminology for diabetes or also just like what the difference was. So I'm excited to just sort of hop in here.
Absolutely. Yeah, you kind of hear these terms thrown out a lot around like blood sugar and insulin. And it's like, all right, I know maybe these things, how they pertain, but when you kind of fit those pieces together and understand how the body is so resourceful in getting what it needs when it needs it, but also the ways that can go wrong. It's just really fascinating.
Yes. So let's jump into Metabolism 101.
Oh man, we gotta come now that you said that about Sapolsky. I'm like, man, we've got to come with jokes. We gotta
I know. You feel the
yeah.
pressure now, don't you? So I think he really breaks this down, right? Like last week, we talked a little bit about the impact that stress has on our bodies and how it basically liquidates our body's resources, right? And this is what he says. I mean, the title of this chapter is Liquidating Your Assets, right? Like it's kind of silly, right? Like, but basically what happens is that when we eat, our body takes macronutrients, which is basically proteins, fats, and sugars. Proteins, fats, and sugars. And stores those in our body cells. That's basically what happened. Proteins, I think, are called amino acids. Fats are called fatty acids. And fatty acids. And then sugar is glucose. And for me, this was like the first eye-opening moment because I'd always heard about glucose, but I didn't realize it was sugar. And he has this beautiful sort of breakdown where which makes it, I think, really, really useful, right? And so for certain things, it's pretty straightforward, right? Like if you're eating a steak, that's mostly protein, so you're getting a lot of amino acids, right? And if you're like me and you love a good ribeye, there's lots of marbling, there's lots of fat, and that fat is going straight into, fatty acids. That's basically what it's turning into. And then basically everything else is sort of turned into glucose in the body.
Yeah.
Which was fascinating to me because I thought, oh, this is why people talk about having blood sugar spikes. And I'm like, but you're not eating a Twix bar, you're eating a sandwich, right? Like how's this spiking your blood sugar? Well, starches, grains, carbohydrates, like those things are all bread, right? Your body just turns it right into glucose, into sugar. That's gonna spike your blood sugar. And basically from there, what he sort of says is your body's way of storing these resources, the glucose, the fat, and the proteins, is through this hormone called insulin. So insulin basically tells your cells, hey, absorb all these nutrients, and we're going to store it for later. Right.
And that it can, I think it's important too to say, like, as it's being stored, the insulin also kind of shifts as it's being stored in those cells. It changes form a bit. So like you gave the example of proteins, how as it enters the bloodstream, it enters in as amino acids. But as the insulin is storing it in those cells, if there's a surplus, it converts it back to a protein and it hangs out in the cell, right, waiting to be tapped in as protein. And then in order for it to be converted back, right, if there's any sort of need for energy or a burst of energy, it gets converted back to amino acid so that it can enter the bloodstream again.
Yes.
And so it's this kind of like going back and forth depending on where it's being stored, how it's being used. The body is amazing in
Yes.
the way it converts this to kind of optimize storage, to optimize the way that it can be potentially used for energy later on.
Yes, exactly. And he talks about that in the book, right? And part of what he says is glucocorticoids, right? Sugar-based glucose, sugar, corticoids, the sort of stress hormones, and adrenaline. Like those are some of the chemicals, those are some of the hormones in our bodies that say, okay, it's time to convert these things out of storage, back into the amino acids, back into whatever, and then we can use them in our bodies. So absolutely, that's what happens. So I think the question I have for you before we get into like the next sort of section was, is there any sort of nuance to this that we have to address, right? We're sort of laying out a really basic understanding, but we don't want to lay it out too basic that it's blatantly wrong.
Right.
Right?
Right. There's a point where we can
It's a
oversimplify
point
it,
where we
right?
can grossly oversimplify, and then it's just like
Yeah.
that's not how. So is there any sort of nuance that you're aware of that you're like, well, that's basically it, but we need to know about this?
Yeah, I think that when I'm thinking about the metabolic system of the human body, the tension that I want to hold is the body is so resourceful, right? To convert energy in the way that's most adaptive, given especially the level of stress and the need that the body has. But even though that's amazing and we want to be aware of the ways that it does that, I think also being aware at the same time of how incredibly taxing that is for the body to do that. Because we talk about it kind of like it's this simplistic process of, okay, then it changes to an amino acid and then it changes back to a protein when it's stored, and then the body converts it back. It does take a lot of energy for the body to do that. And I want to make sure as we're talking about kind of the basics of that, that piece doesn't get missed, that it does take kind of this expense, right, of getting it converted back and getting it what it needs to, does, cost the body to have kind of this switching back and forth, even though it does it every day, right? Whenever I automatically need to sprint to catch something, right? Or like there's some like physical need that comes up, but that does take a lot of energy for our bodies to make that conversion back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think for me, the thing I want people to really get it from this section, and this is something that I did not understand about polyvagal theory, is this is what we mean when we say the different states prime us for different behaviors and prime us for different responses, right? Like, because your body is primed under stress to release these energy stores into the muscles so that the muscles can do whatever they need to do to keep us safe. Our body is not primed to absorb nutrients. And I think for me, when I was learning about polyvagal theory, I didn't grok that sort of concept, right? And so really, I think for me, it's like, oh, if you're in a state of chronic stress and you're eating food, right, you're actually working against, in some ways, what your body is trying to do. And I think sometimes that's why people get into really weird habits and have sort of weird medical conditions at times, not all the times. It's because they are working against what their body is trying to do.
Absolutely. So as my body is saying, I'm stressed, I'm feeling overwhelmed, right, and it mobilizes in the way that it does, it can kind of send some confusing signals, right? Because it's sending off the message, I need to mobilize, go ahead and shut down digestion, go ahead and shut down everything that's not essential, get, blood to the muscles, release all that energy. At times, right, especially if we have this propensity towards stress eating, then the body's like, wait, what? What is this? Like, you don't do this when we're stressed. I need to mobilize. We're trying to fight or flight here. Why are you giving me more to do? I can't digest this right now. Right. And that's where we see kind of some confusing digestive issues come up because I'm not able to have my body digest food the way that it's meant to when I'm in this state of stress, right? And with the metabolic system, it also causes some issues, right, with how it's stored or how I'm able to access that energy if it's consistently coming. So I think that that's a really important piece that you're talking about
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. So we have our nuance, right? We have the fact that, hey, this is a costly process for the body to take these things, convert them out of their forms and back and store them in the cells, and then convert them back to what we need out of the cells so we can get it into the muscles. Like that process is costly. And also this process primes our body to do different things. Okay. This also is a section where he talks about chronic fatigue. And I wanted to ask you about that, right? Because he basically says that chronic fatigue is an underactive stress response. So when our metabolism can't, for whatever reason, sort of speed up and get us into fight or flight, that's and we need to be sort of more activated. That's when we get chronic fatigue.
Yeah, absolutely. When the body has, a need to mobilize itself due to the energy demands that are there, but I can't, my body can't keep up with that load. It can't keep up with what's being asked of it. That's when that chronic fatigue syndrome can set in because my body can't produce the energy, right, necessary in order to mobilize me in the way that my body's asking for.
And this feels to me like a variant of the freeze response, of sort of that dorsal vagal shutdown, right? Of that shutdown that we go into that kind of becomes chronic. Would you say that that's outside of the realm of possibility? Would you put that sort of in this
No, I
level? What
could
would you say?
definitely see that being there. And I also see it being talked about that eventually my body just burns out, especially if that fight or flight response has been activated for so long. The load, we've used this term before in here, but the allostatic load that my body is, putting forth to constantly mobilize me, eventually I just can't keep up with that pace anymore. Eventually it has to slow down. It doesn't activate in the same way because it just doesn't have the energy or the space to anymore.
Yeah.
But I think that whenever our fight or flight is depleted, that's where we see kind of that most primitive branch of the vagal nerve activated according to polyvagal theory, right? Where we can get that dorsal activation where the body's saying, I can't put up the same fight or flight that I have before, right? And maybe that shutdown process enters in there. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to the physiology, right? It's like, even if it's not necessarily due to an external stressor, if the fight or flight response is overwhelmed, physiologically what our bodies then revert to is the shutdown response.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think this is really also pertinent to us because of the brain. So we haven't talked about this yet, but one of my few reoccurring guests, right? The person who's been on the show the second number of times compared to you. I mean, you're number one right now, right?
All right. What a streak.
What
I'll
a
take
streak,
it.
yes. Is Dr. Bonnie Kaplan. And she sent me one of her books called The Better Brain Book. She's written a lot of research on the brain and nutrition. And I think she is one of just the luminaries of the field. And basically her whole thing is about the brain and metabolism and how the brain uses nutrition. So basically what she says is, even though the brain is only 2% of your body weight, which is just like, that's tiny, right? It's 20 to 40% of your body's metabolic load, right? She says 20% roughly of your body's blood, which is carrying all these nutrients, passes through your brain every minute. So actually, when you're eating to power your brain. And so what she's done is she's really looked into the research on nutrition and the brain, and she basically says, look, your brain functioning is completely dependent on your brain's metabolism. And where people in the past have gone wrong is that they've said, okay, nutrition is really important, and they've made one or two big mistakes. They've then tried to treat different problems with a single nutrient approach, right? Well, you just need more B12. She's like, well, that's not how things work, because the brain is really complicated. All of these different micronutrients sort of work together. So if we're going to think about the brain as the primary metabolic load, we can't just give it one chemical to make it work better. We have to give it all of the things that it really needs. So she advocates for a broad spectrum micronutrient. And then the question is like, what is a micronutrient, right? And that leads us to the second problem that people sort of miss when they're talking about your brain and your brain metabolism and your mental health. And she basically says macronutrients are the things that Sapolsky has already talked about: proteins, carbohydrates and sugars, fatty acids. Everything else, vitamins, minerals, those are what she talks about as micronutrients. And it's when your brain gets low levels of these, especially during moments of stress, when your brain really needs it, that you can see all sorts of issues later on. So, and she's got study after study. She has this really beautiful study that she did where there was a earthquake, I think in New Zealand, where her colleague works, and they tested the impact of people who got broad spectrum micronutrients versus people who didn't, on things like anxiety, depression, PTSD. And the people who got the broad spectrum micronutrients did better than the ones who didn't. So for me, knowing her, having talked to her several times, having read her book and some of her research, I was like, this is crazy. And especially when you think about metabolism and how the biggest part of your metabolism, right? The biggest single organ that's really taking all this energy is your brain. It's like, we can't not talk about this.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it really, I'm so glad that you brought that up, Jordan, because I do think it highlights, right, the interdependence that our body has. And I think we're really good in 2022 of dividing between brain and body, mental health and physical health, right? But appreciating the way that we're trying to do in this series, the wholeness, right, of the system, that one really does have an effect on the other. I think it offers, again, a lot of hope of, okay, there are so many avenues, right, that I need to be considering. This isn't just X plus Y always equals Z, that there are some variations in that to be considered, and understanding the impact that the metabolic load has on brain functioning, right, and all of mental health within that really helps us to approach that more holistically, so that one, as like clinicians, we can offer more holistic care, but it also gives people more clarity in how they can best care for themselves as well.
Yeah, I
Mm.
think that's true. And I think that's one of the things that going through this series sort of taught me.
Mm.
The more that I learn about my body and the more that I see clients and hear them talk about their bodies, it's like, oh, this whole thing really makes sense. Like,
Mhm.
I think it's too simplistic to talk about the body as a machine,
Mm.
but also I think that if we keep that as a metaphor, you really begin to see how this whole thing works together, you know?
Mm.
Um, and I find that really fascinating.
Mm.
And also, I think it fills me with hope, right?
Mm.
Because that means there's multiple ways to solve these problems and to get
Mm.
movement for people who are suffering.
Exactly, exactly. Because if I have this one approach and I'm taking the vitamins and I'm changing my diet the way that I've been told to, and I'm not seeing movement, right? And I'm
Right.
still struggling in the same ways, that does feel hopeless, right? It feels like this is going to be my reality forever, right? Understanding the different impacts that micronutrients have, right? And approaching this from a holistic perspective of, okay, what impact is my stress having, right? On the metabolic load that my body's carrying, being able to appreciate that does offer hope, right? That things don't just have to be stuck because of the way that my body is doing things right now.
Yeah. Yep. 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 Um, okay. So let's jump in and talking about juvenile diabetes.
Mhm.
Now, did you know that? I'm sure you probably did because you've studied all of this stuff. But did you cover this in your coursework, juvenile diabetes, or any of that sort?
I didn't cover it as much. And so this was a lot of learning for me that honestly was really helpful. And even when I thought about kind of friends of mine that had and have had for a long time juvenile diabetes, it just helped me kind of understand kind of all that's going on for them and all the language I've heard them use. So this is very
This is
informative
new.
for me. Yeah.
Yeah. So, on a very basic level, it sounds like juvenile diabetes is an autoimmune issue almost, right? The immune
Mm.
system attacks the pancreas, and the pancreas's job is to create insulin.
Mhm.
And insulin, as we talked about, is the hormone that says, let's throw all this nutrients. So if your immune system attacks your pancreas
Mhm.
and you're not producing insulin, then your cells starve because there's no mechanism to get the nutrients into the cells,
Mhm.
which is crazy, right? Because then you have all this fat, amino acids, glucose that's just floating around the body,
The
coming up the
bloodstream, yeah.
works, right? Like
Yeah,
floating in your
honestly, though.
bloodstream. It's almost what I imagine it'd be like to be, the sort of old metaphor of water everywhere, but not a drop to spare. Like being out in the ocean and you're surrounded by all this water, but you can't drink it. Like that's basically what it's like. Your cells can't take it in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and so then you get into this sort of negative feedback loop, right? Because one of the ways
Mhm.
that you treat this is through insulin,
You're right. Injections.
insulin
Right.
injections. Um, but if you give the body too much insulin, then the brain doesn't absorb the nutrition, which can lead to
Mm.
something like shock or
Mhm.
going into a coma. So
Mhm.
how like make that connection for us, right? Too much insulin, which is actually what your body needs, can it make it hard for your brain to absorb nutrition?
Right.
How does that
And
work?
so it's this really difficult balance, right? Where you don't want your insulin levels to get too low within the body. That's why you need the injections, because then cells are totally deprived of energy, but also that circulating glucose gets too high. And so, of course, you need the injections, but also and this is maybe a bit over my head, but it also, like you said, it deprives the brain of energy because it's trying to regulate, it's trying to keep glucose from getting too high.
Yeah.
And so it prevents, right, that maybe degree of circulation that a typically functioning system would
Yes.
have, meaning there's not as much glucose getting to the brain
Right.
because the purpose of the insulin is to keep those glucose levels low.
Right.
So too much insulin means not enough glucose getting to the brain. And so it's this really, really tricky balance of how do I keep that level in check to make sure that my body has what it needs.
Right. Right. And my understanding is, I mean, it's almost like a catch-22, right? If you don't have enough insulin, your brain can't absorb this stuff. But on the flip side, if you have too much insulin, what then happens is your body begins to become insulin resistant.
Mhm.
And what that means is because the cells are already full of the nutrients, they go, we can't take any more, even though the insulin is saying, no, you need to take in more. So then the cells become a little bit it becomes resistant, right? It's like if someone's saying, hey, you got to do this, and they're yelling it in your face, after a while, you kind of just tune them out,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
But what that means then is that the next time that they want to say anything to you, they have to just yell at you louder, right? I've seen this with my own kids. I talk about my kids a lot here, but it's like, man, if my kids feel like they're not being heard, what happens?
You gotta get louder.
They get louder. And so the same thing happens to the body, right? As the signals from the insulin get louder, the body sort of pulls back a little bit and goes, okay, and it's not as responsive, which means that then you need more insulin to get the same response, and it becomes this negative sort of feedback loop.
Absolutely. If when there's too much insulin in the body. And so it
Right.
just, I think this section just so made me appreciate the people in my life that I know with juvenile diabetes, right? Or this insulin dependent uh, type, because think of all the forethought that it takes, right? Especially if I know something's going to be more taxing. How do I prepare my body for that with insulin injections? How do I find that balance? I got to make sure I'm checking in with myself on how I'm responding, maybe how much energy I'm putting in to make sure I can ensure that my body gets what it needs. What an incredible, right? Like constant calculation that has to be going on just to get your body what it needs.
Exactly. Yes. And I think that becomes even more apparent when type 1 diabetes then leads to type 2 diabetes, right? At the extreme, if your body then becomes insulin resistant, like completely, right? It's not going, that's what type 2 diabetes is. So type 1 is where your body doesn't make insulin, and type 2 is where your body doesn't respond well to insulin.
Right.
And so, some people can get into these feedback loops where they've been giving themselves insulin, they have been able to find that balance, their body becomes insulin resistant, and then as soon as they get type 1 under control, they wind up with type 2. It's just like, this is a never-ending battle, right? This it sucks so much. So it's a lot of forethought for people who, struggle with this. They've got to really plan out what they're doing.
Yeah, 100%. And then what Sapolsky adds on top of this is the impact, right, that chronic stress has on this whole process. Ultimately saying, right, if the body is constantly attempting to mobilize and to convert this energy into a more usable form, that pumps even more glucose, more fatty acid that needs to be in the bloodstream. And so they're more likely to gum up in the wrong places and cause these really severe metabolic issues. And, Zapolsky says, because of that issue, it's that much more important for those with diabetes to manage their stress. But my gosh, as I'm reading this, I'm like, it's so stressful just to, right, just to make sure my body's getting what it needs. How can I possibly manage it when I'm automatically set up to have more stress than most people do.
Yeah.
It's got, like you said, this like never ending feedback loop then of, okay, stress takes a harder hit on my body. I need to protect it from it.
Yeah.
But in order to protect it, it's kind of stressful to constantly be monitoring and making sure I'm doing a good job and checking my levels and making sure I have access to whatever I need to level that out. And my gosh.
Yeah. 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 Because it, part of the effect of the stress is to make your body temporarily insulin resistant.
Right.
And so if you're stressed out chronically, your body is primed to be insulin resistant, which is like, it's a catch-22.
Yeah.
And me, I'm my we don't talk about this often, right? But sort of where I am in the field is in the deliberate practice side of the field. And I think for me, that's where education really becomes really important, right? Like if I was running a clinic, I would want people to be very confident and to really practice how do they measure their levels of glucose, how do they give themselves injections, how do they do all of these things. And I think that level of education and skill building with this population is huge, not just because of the skills.
Right.
If they have the confidence of competence,
Mm-hmm.
then it helps to reduce the stress of just having the disease, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I know how to manage this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be really helpful for a lot of people. I don't know how many people get that,
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes when I go to the doctor, they just say, oh yeah, well, we'll just do this. And I'm like, but what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think even what you're slightly alluding to there is, related to polyvagal theory, right? Of, okay, my body is going to mobilize energy differently if I am able to connect, right, around this stressor. And if I have a partner or a parent or a roommate that is aware and is in this with me and is kind of helping me check in and is saying, oh, I brought this for you just in case, right? That not carrying the weight of that stress by myself. From a polyvagal perspective, then my limbic response doesn't need to be activated because my load is shared, because that social engagement system, that ventral vagal complex of the vagus nerve is activated. So my body doesn't need to mobilize in the same way. I think polyvagal theory offers this really beautiful solution to those with an intense metabolic load, right? Of the power of connection to not feel alone in that battle, right? Because if I'm able to activate that social engagement system, that means I can bypass that limbic response and that limbic reactivity, so that my body doesn't need to metabolize in the same way, that it's not constantly getting switched on, right? And the same is true, right, without diabetes, that my body doesn't have to put forth this allostatic load when it's constantly being activated if I'm able to activate my social engagement system and connect with people around me instead.
Yeah. I think, so that brings up so many thoughts. And I think the first thought is, I have so many thoughts. Let me try to get them organized. You can tell that this is like a live program, right? Because it's like, wow, I'm just being impacted live, real time about what you're saying. The first thing is, I think we really need to be clear on educating people, which is part of what we're doing now. I think that brings confidence. And if you think about polyvagal theory, which is really the science of safety, one of the sort of innate safety cues is predictability. And I think education sort of brings that, right? Like I know what to expect, which actually means I feel a little bit safer. And I think,
And sorry, and also it normalizes it.
and it
This isn't
normalizes
my body malfunctioning. I'm not broken. This is normal.
Right.
Other people experience this
Right.
too. I thought it also serves to connect and create that safety in that
Right.
way as well.
Right. So you have the skill, the competence and confidence of a skill. You have the normalization and the education, which leads to predictability of I know it's coming. And then also something that you just mentioned is our ability to regulate and how that impacts our fight or flight response, which of course impacts our body's level of insulin resistance, right? And it reminds me of, you've probably never heard of this, but there was like a little known study done, I think like 40 years ago, by Salvador Minuchin. And I don't have all the details. I'm just thinking of this now. But basically what he showed was family therapy had a positive impact on kids who had diabetes and helping them to regulate. And the study, of course, you know, the way that they did research back then was different. And so some people have questioned the methodology and things necessarily haven't been reproduced or replicated. But I think we shouldn't throw it out, right? Because, and I think this is important, not for everybody, but for some people, when you have that person who you can co-regulate with, like we understand why, for some people, that can really, really help eliminate lots of the problems, such as symptoms of juvenile diabetes or even adult onset diabetes, right? Whatever the cause is. So it's in the literature, it happens for some people, and now we kind of understand why.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think once again, we're just going to sound like the most broken records here, but it is an issue of kind of rigidity. If every time my body feels any sort of stress or any sort of challenge, right, which is inevitable during the day, even small ones, like I opened the door or the fridge doors this morning and we're out of milk, and it's like, oh man, like even small stressors like that, right? If my only option that my body knows is to like internalize those little stressors, but all those, so the big ones where I experience major loss, right? Or major life transition. If my only option there is to kind of fight or flight, figure it out myself, internalize it, let my body put up this response in whatever way it can, that is going to have a severe impact on my body.
Absolutely.
Right. But if I can have more flexibility, right, and I can turn, to my partner and say, shoot, we're out of milk. What do you think we should do? And he says, well, we'll just make this instead. Right. That's a totally different experience for my body. Right. Where it's like, oh, okay, I don't have to carry the weight of this by myself. Right. And in the same way with major losses as well, just not feeling alone in it gives our body more flexibility in that response. I don't have to mobilize. I don't have to activate the sympathetic response. I don't have to go into fight or flight, right, which wears on my body over time. I can have more flexibility depending on the severity of the stressor, and I can reach out when I need it, which means that my body doesn't have to go through this cascading effect of trying to mobilize me, that it's not meant to live in all the time.
I think that dovetails beautifully with Sapolsky's last point in this chapter, right? Where he says frequent stress or big stressors might increase the odds of getting juvenile diabetes and accelerate the development of juvenile diabetes. And once established, cause major complications in this life-shortening disease, right? He talks about how there have been a few studies where they've shown people that for a lot of people with juvenile diabetes, they've had a lot of stressors before they get juvenile diabetes. So it's sort of this idea that for some people, having a series of stressors impacts the body in such a way that then their body no longer produces insulin. And so for people like that, and we don't understand a lot about that yet, right? But for people like that, their ability to co-regulate, their ability to use that social engagement system, for whatever reason, probably was hampered or impaired, or the body just couldn't do it for any number of probably really valid reasons. And so yeah, it's kind of like, okay, for certain people, not for everybody, having big stressors is a not precondition, yeah, a precondition for developing juvenile diabetes. Yeah. So let's move on to adult diabetes. So we've talked a little bit about this, right? In juvenile diabetes, your body no longer makes insulin, but in adult diabetes, type 2 diabetes, your body no longer responds to insulin. And he says, in 1990, there was 15% of adults over the age of 65 who have adult diabetes. And I looked up the stats, and let's just say things have only gotten worse. Right. Apparently 27%, 26.8% of Americans have diabetes, have type 2 diabetes, according to the CDC. Most estimates that I could find, they didn't really separate out type 1 and type 2. But they do say that type 2 accounts for about 90 to 95% of the cases. So yeah, I mean, these numbers are only getting worse, which is a big deal. In the book, he said 200,000 Americans died due to diabetes. And this was what, 2004, I believe this book was written. And in 2017, I looked it up, diabetes was the 7th leading cause of death in the US. Which is like, wow. So there's 270,000 deaths due to diabetes in 2017, which is like a lot of people. And this is important because the same way that stress impacts juvenile diabetes, it impacts adult diabetes, right? It makes your body more insulin resistant. It makes it harder for your cells to get what they need. And then you have all this stuff, sort of, these macronutrients, these proteins, amino acids, fatty acids, and glucose that's just free floating in your bloodstream. And so, yeah, right, like, this is a big deal. And
absolutely.
The thing for me that I learned after this was this Newcastle diet. Have you heard of this Newcastle diet?
Not until you had introduced it.
Yeah. So this is really fascinating. So there was a study, it was a very small study, but they've gone on to promote this as a diet in the UK. And so something to talk with your medical professional about, right? Where they've basically gave people a 600 calorie a day diet, which is tiny. I mean, that's a really low.
Pretty small.
That's pretty small diet for 8 weeks. And they gave this diet to 11 people, and 7 out of the 11 people, when they tested them 3 months later, no longer qualified for the characteristics of having diabetes. Now, this is a hard thing to do, and if your medical professional recommends that you can do this, then it's something to look into, right? But I know, and that the hardest part about this diet is going to be sticking to it. Right? like, and so on the one hand, there's hope, and on the other hand, like, this is really hard. And I think this also comes back to sort of a polyvagal perspective, right? Because I think that for people who want to go down this route, we know that the level of your connections is probably the biggest predictor of success, right? I mean, that's why things like CrossFit, I think, are so engaging, right? CrossFit makes it about, okay, me and this group of people, we're on this journey to get fit.
Absolutely.
And so I would bet the same thing is true here of like, okay, how well I'm able to work with my family members on this diet. You know, is my
Mhm.
partner or my kids or my aunts and uncles or my friends sort of like in this with me? It's probably going to be a
Mhm.
big predictor of how well you can stick to this diet or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, because it also serves as like a buffer for the additional stress that comes in, right? If
Right.
I'm able to talk with someone about it and share that experience with them, I'm not going to need to seek out familiar strategies to kind of regulate myself, especially around food, right? Which is a big way that we look to regulate ourselves or kind of reverse that fight or flight response. If I can get myself enough comfort through what I'm eating, then maybe I can downregulate. But if I'm able to receive that from another person, my need for that is just a lot smaller.
Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
that's so true, right? Like having those relationships help you when you're like,
Yeah.
man, I'm really hungry, or man, I'm having headaches, or man, I'm dizzy from this diet.
Mhm.
And it helps you with the previous coping strategies, right? Maybe your coping strategy
Mhm.
was to go out and, if you're like me, eat a pack of Pop Tarts, right? But if you have that relationship, you can
Mhm.
co-regulate that instead of having that old
Mhm.
coping mechanism.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm. Because we all know that feeling, right? Of reaching for something. It's like, I'm not even hungry. I don't even think I really like wanted this,
yeah,
but I'm already at the bottom of the bag. What happened? Right. And a
yeah,
lot of the time it's like my body knows that this releases something in me that feels good.
yeah,
And I need to feel good right now. And so it is this automatic response that the
right.
body looks for comfort.
Yeah. I think that's so true, and that's actually very polyvagal, right?
Mhm.
You know, Porter talks a lot about this, how babies early on, the
Mhm.
first way that they co-regulate before relationships
Mhm.
is through nursing.
Yeah.
And so what they're doing is that they're stimulating those muscles
Mhm.
of sucking, swallowing,
Mhm.
of the larynx and the pharynx. I don't know that word. You probably do better than I do. Um,
Right.
and and so in some ways,
Mhm.
when we go to food in
Mhm.
order to self-soothe and to regulate, we're going to like this really primal sort of way
Mhm.
that infants, that babies, right, use to co-regulate.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so it makes a lot of sense. And I think for me,
Mhm.
I'm going to go on a little bit of a soapbox here. This
Please.
is really important because I've had a few clients, usually females, who come in and they say, I have an eating disorder.
Mhm.
And some people do.
Mhm.
But what I actually hear my clients, the few that I've had who told me this, what I'm actually hearing is when I am upset, when I'm
Mhm.
angry, when I'm sad, my first way of trying to soothe myself is to go to food.
Mhm.
And I think if you understand polyvagal theory, what that says is that's normal. That's sort of
Mhm.
baked into what it means to be human. Because
Absolutely. You're looking to
your
regulate. Mhm.
physiology
Mhm.
is trying to regulate, like you're
Mhm.
saying. And one of the oldest first ways that we do that is through sucking, chewing, and swallowing.
Mhm. Absolutely. Not to mention, right, when I do eat, these, chemicals are released into my
Right,
bloodstream that do feel good, that
right,
do temporarily give me energy,
right.
right? Or whatever it is. And that feels good as well.
Yeah,
And so, again, this is a part of the way that the body tries to restore that allostatic balance.
right,
If I feel bad, if I'm feeling stressed, my body says, you know what's made you feel better before? Let's grab that bag of Cheetos. I
right,
know exactly where that ton of ice cream is in the
right,
freezer. Like,
right,
let's do that. That's a quick fix here just to kind of restore where we need to be chemically, comfort wise, the level of arousal that's at present. Like, this can get us back to where we need to be.
right, right. And so, absolutely. And so, what my fear is that they come in and it almost feels like they're ashamed of their need. Like when they say that, what I hear is my body is trying to co-regulate, but it doesn't know how.
Mhm.
And it feels like they're ashamed of that. And I want people to know that's normal.
Mhm.
sort of baked into you, right? When a baby's crying early on, month 1, if you're a preemie, you know, what they're saying is, I need to co-regulate. And the way that I do that is through nursing, sucking, swallowing, all those sorts of things. And so I want people to know that that's normal to sort of have that need. And how can we help you to do that better?
Absolutely. That there's so much focus, I think, right now on the bad behavior,
Yeah.
right? Or labeling it as bad and unhealthy or whatever it is, right? But there's no addressing kind of what drives that behavior initially, right?
Yeah.
And a colleague of ours, George Fowler, always references this Irish saying that says, everyone wants to talk about the drink, no one wants to talk about the thirst, right? And the thirst that's there in that is, I need regulation. I feel unstable. I feel unsafe. I feel like things are out of control. This is a way that I get some stability and some regulatory capacity, which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that piece. Let's talk about how we can get that thirst satisfied so you don't have to reach for that same drink that's not getting you the effects that are giving you the results that you're wanting.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it.
Mm.
Okay. And so then in the last part of this chapter, Sapolsky talks about metabolic syndrome, syndrome X. Do you want to take this one over? Why don't you take this one over? And what do you want me to?
Oh, how kind of you. Because I actually had not heard of this before
Oh,
Zapolsky
really?
introduced it. So this is new to me, so I can do my best here. And so basically what Sapolsky is connecting in this is the relationship that the metabolic and the cardiovascular systems have with one another. And so syndrome X is kind of creating this new term that recognizes their interrelatedness.
Yeah.
Right. And so it has it kind of references, just like we've been talking about, when there's these elevated levels of insulin in the blood, there's elevated glucose levels. What impact does that have, right, on systolic, diastolic blood pressure, right? That all of those are very much related. We talked about kind of gumming up the works, right, preventing that blood flow as that happens, and just kind of appreciating kind of the relationship between them. That insulin resistance, right, your body's inability to store those creates just too much getting clogged up in the blood. There's too much fat or there's too much cholesterol within that, which prevents it from circulating the way that it typically does. So this combination of things results in this metabolic syndrome. Kind of this combination of factors there.
Yeah. I think the thing about this that was really interesting to me was, I mean, he's basically saying, you know, if you look at levels of anything, basically, right? Let's say glucose, blood pressure, and cholesterol. And if these are all slightly elevated, right, they're on the far end of normal, but they're still in the normal range. Looking at these things as a whole, right? They are predictors of things like heart attack, stroke, mortality, right? And so it's this, it's the way that I imagine it is, I imagine that I'm like, I don't know why this comes to me, but I imagine it like I'm at a nuclear power plant, right? And I'm the foreman, and one of the little dials goes, you know, into the yellow. With one guy, if one dial goes to the yellow, it's not a problem. If it goes to the red, we have a big problem. But if one dial's in the yellow, it's not a problem. But we got so focused on looking at, well, is this dial in the red or not? That what we did for a long time is that we began to ignore the fact that if 20 dials are in the yellow, we have a problem.
Yeah.
You know, and that's sort of what he's saying with syndrome X is, if you look at your levels of any number of things, And for this example, we're just using glucose, blood pressure, and HDL cholesterol, and
Mhm.
they're all slightly elevated.
Mhm.
You have what they call technically syndrome X or metabolic
Mhm.
syndrome. And having those 3, those 4, those 5 that are all in the yellow
Mhm.
is actually a better predictor of a slew of problems
Mhm.
than any one of these things alone.
Mhm.
And so it kind of goes back to what we've talked about of like taking a holistic look, right?
Mhm.
Not getting so focused on this one thing that we get zoned in, but can we zoom out, take a big picture, and look at all of these things?
Mhm.
And for me, this is what really helped to concretize what he means by allostatic load and allostatic
Mhm.
balance, right?
Mhm.
Um, the way I was taught, we were sort of taught under that idea of like homeostasis, right?
Mhm.
And he gives this great example of the difference between allostatic and allostasis and homeostasis, right? He's like, if you were in California and there was a water shortage, and
Mhm.
you're thinking from a homeostatic sort of mentality,
Mhm.
you're going to produce you're going to offer like a one-shot sort of solution to balance things out.
Mhm.
Well, we'll just make smaller water tanks for homes,
Mhm.
right? Um, but the body is way more complex than that. There's way more holistic stuff sort of going on.
Mhm.
And so from an allostatic perspective, you might do something like um, convince people to conserve water, right?
Mhm.
Also have smaller toilet tanks, have smaller water heater tanks, do less water intensive farming. You're going to do all these different things across the different dials of your society
Mhm.
to bring things back into balance.
Mhm. Recognizing that all of those have a role to play,
Right.
right, in the balance that the body's trying to achieve. So me being able to focus on multiple, right, of those dials, or those solutions like that you offered is ultimately going to benefit all of them, not just the one that I'm focusing on.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
this is sort of like the moment where I feel like I kind of got the big idea in polyvagal
Mhm.
theory,
Mhm.
because when you when when Porges is talking to physicians,
Mhm.
part of what he's trying to get them to do is to make a shift into an allostatic mindset, right? He's saying, okay, the body's whole purpose
Mhm.
is to maintain sort of this allostatic balance.
Mhm.
And so doing one thing over here sometimes misses the point.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there's an emotional component to that.
Mhm.
And there's also a physiological side of that, right?
Yeah.
And so we know one of my favorite studies was um, they tracked the outcomes of psychiatrists.
Mhm.
And the psychiatrists who were more friendly had clients who did better on the same medication as the ones who weren't. And it's like,
Mhm.
why? What is going on here?
Mhm.
Right? Like those things matter.
Mhm.
And then also, like, how are you thinking about helping this person? Is it just, let me
Mhm.
give you this one thing,
Mhm.
you know? Or am I looking at you from a multifaceted sort of perspective?
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, so if you have diabetes, we're talking about insulin and your relationships and your nutrition and how you're
Mhm.
managing stress. Or are we just saying, well, take this one thing and it'll make you better? Like those things don't add up
Right. As much as we want them to. How
as much
much
as we want.
easier would it be, right, if I did take this pill, right, or if I started this medication and it balanced out everything else, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the hard part here is that complexity is beautiful and it offers us so many options of how to care well for ourselves and how to offer care as clinicians, but it's not the simplicity that people are hoping for, right? Because we want this to be a simple solution. But if going through this book has taught me anything, it's really understanding the complexity of the body, the complexity of the way it responds to stress, that it needs to be addressed kind of with that same level of interdependence,
Mm,
as we talk about how do we provide relief in these spaces.
yeah.
Mm.
All right, Dr. Conroy. So what's your takeaway from today? What's your closing thought?
Yeah, I do. I think honestly, this was really fun for me. I think we've done a lot of the cardiovascular stuff, and I just love learning about just new systems in the body and helping me appreciate the complexity that the body has. So I loved just learning about how the body really metabolizes and kind of getting the basics of that, but also seeing that this too, right? If this is kind of how the body has to respond to energy or has to respond to stress, right? Is mobilizing and getting more energy. It really clarifies for me the response can't be to eliminate stress. I'd love for that to be the case, but this is Earth last time I checked. And it's just going to be stressful. And so it really clarifies for me the goal in this. The only hope that's really offered is how can I get flexibility where my body doesn't need to only have one way to respond to stress?
Yeah. I think for me, the big thing from this section was learning about the energy that our body needs and the different types of that,
Mm,
right? Like
mm-hmm,
um, learning about the difference between glucose,
mm-hmm,
amino acids, and fatty acids. Like, oh,
mm-hmm,
because I think, I am interested in this idea of nutrition,
mm-hmm,
but I didn't understand the basic building blocks of that.
mm-hmm,
And then talking with Bonnie Kaplan and getting into the micronutrients and how, okay, these things all work together.
mm-hmm,
Um, so for me, understanding sort of like the basics of how our body, or the energy stores that our body uses, was really
mm-hmm,
interesting. And then how nuanced this is and complex, right? I think that was also really interesting on a personal level
mm-hmm,
of, yeah, if we're going to help people, we have to come at it from the sort of multi-dimensional way,
mm-hmm,
but there's also the direction to that, right? It's not just we'll just do 8 different things and throw them at you. It's like these things all need to sort of be organized by
mm-hmm,
polyvagal theory, which says it's all about helping people to co-regulate.
mm-hmm,
And once we can do that, like then our bodies will be primed for health, growth, and
mm-hmm,
restoration.
mm-hmm,
So I think for me, the complexity of it all, but also how polyvagal theory, I think, offers a map forward.
mm-hmm. Ah,
It's been really, really cool.
beautifully said there, Dr. Harris. I
Oh,
love
thank you, Dr.
that.
Conroy. Okay.
I do. I think that's a really beautiful map forward, a really helpful one.
All right. Well, look, I'll see you next week.
All right, looking forward to it.